My name is Simone Arsenault. I am 44 years old. I want to start with the wall. Not the legal process, not the hearing, not the specific Thursday morning in April when the attorney placed an audio cassette on the conference table and asked if any of us recognized the voice. I want to start with the wall because the wall is where my grandmother kept the truth for 34 years, and because a woman who hides a voice recording inside the wall of her house and trusts the wall to keep it safe until someone needs it is the specific kind of woman whose story requires you to understand her before you can understand anything else. Her name was Marguerite Celestine Arsenault. She was born in 1931 in the house on Pelican Street in Lafayette, Louisiana, the second daughter of Edouard and Clotilde Arsenault, who had built the house in 1928 from cypress wood and determination and the particular knowledge of construction that Edouard had accumulated across 20 years of building other people's houses in the Teche country, and who had understood, when he built his own, that a house built from cypress would outlast everyone who would ever live in it. He was right. The house on Pelican Street was still standing when my aunts tried to sell it, 93 years after Edouard built it, its cypress bones as sound as they had been in 1928. The particular permanence of old-growth Louisiana cypress that has survived the specific humidity and the specific heat and the specific weight of everything that Louisiana weather can put on a structure. My grandmother had lived in that house for all but 7 years of her life. She was born in it, grew up in it, left it when she married my grandfather Joseph in 1952, and moved to the house on Evangeline Street where they raised their children, and came back to it in 1974 when her mother Clotilde died, and the house needed someone to inhabit it and maintain it, and be, as my grandmother understood it, responsible for it. She was responsible for it for 47 years. She was the one who called the plumber and negotiated with the roofer, and planted the pecan tree in the backyard in 1978, and tended the fig tree that her father had planted in 1932, and kept the cypress walls oiled against the Lafayette humidity, and maintained every system in the house with the particular focused care of someone who understood that a house is a living system requiring continuous attention. She was also the one who, in 1987, went into the storage room off the back hallway, opened the wall panel behind the water heater that her father had built with a removable section specifically because he said a man should be able to check the pipes without taking his walls apart, and placed a cassette tape inside the wall cavity with a note wrapped around it, and replaced the panel, and did not tell anyone it was there. Except me. She told me in 2019, 2 years before she died, sitting on the back porch of the house on Pelican Street, in the specific October light of Lafayette, that is warm and golden, and feels like something you should hold on to because you know it is going to change. She was 88 years old, and her mind was still specific, and her voice was still the voice I had known since I was born, and she looked at me for a long moment and said, "Simone." There is something in the wall behind the water heater in the back room. I need you to know it's there, I said, "Grandmère." What did you put in the wall? She said, "The truth, in case anyone decides they need it." She died in March of 2021. My aunts filed their claim in September of the same year. I found what was in the wall in November. Before I tell you what was on the tape, let me take you to the beginning. Because the beginning is where the specific shape of my family was established, and where I first understood what my grandmother was doing across the 47 years she was responsible for the house on Pelican Street, and where the particular dynamic that produced my aunt's claim in September was first visible to the people who were paying attention. I grew up in Lafayette, Louisiana, the only child of Raymond and Denise Arsenault, who had met at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette in 1977, and married the year they graduated and built their life in Lafayette, because both of their families had been in Lafayette for generations, and neither of them had ever seriously considered being anywhere else. My father was a high school history teacher who spent 31 years at the same school and who brought to his classroom the particular focused intelligence of someone who understood that teaching history was the specific work of helping young people understand that the present was built from the past, and that the past was built by people who made specific choices, and that the choices people made were determined by what they understood, and what they valued, and what they were afraid of. My mother worked for the Lafayette Parish School System in Special Education Administration, the specific demanding work of ensuring that the children who needed the most specific kinds of educational support received what they needed within a system that was not always organized to provide it. She was good at this in the particular way of people who combine genuine care for the people they serve with the specific bureaucratic competence required to navigate institutional systems effectively. I was their only child, born in 1980, and I was raised in the particular way of only children of attentive parents, which is with the specific combination of close attention and high expectation that produces either a person who is very capable and self-sufficient, or a person who cannot function without external validation. I became the former, which I attribute primarily to my grandmother. My grandmother Marguerite was the specific gravitational center of the Arsenault family, the specific person around whom all the other relationships organized, and to whom everyone in the family oriented when orientation was needed. She had 4 children, my father Raymond, who was the oldest, and 3 daughters, Marie-Claire, Yvette, and Bernadette, who were the specific aunts whose claim I am about to describe. I want to describe my aunts honestly rather than simply, because honesty requires acknowledging that they were not villains in any uncomplicated sense. They were 3 women who had grown up in the same family as my father, and who had their own specific relationships with their mother and their own specific understandings of what those relationships entitled them to, and what my grandmother's intentions had always been. Marie-Claire was 61 at the time of the claim, a retired pharmacist who had spent her career in Baton Rouge and who had moved back to Lafayette after her retirement, because Lafayette was where the family was, and retirement was when you went back to where the family was. She was organized and practical and had the specific quality of someone who managed things efficiently and who became frustrated when things were not managed efficiently, and the management of my grandmother's estate was, in her view, not being managed efficiently. Yvette was 58, still working as a nurse practitioner at a Lafayette medical clinic, practical and direct, and the specific sibling who said what the others were thinking in any family conversation. She had been the one who raised practical concerns about the house on Pelican Street during my grandmother's final years, questions about maintenance costs and insurance, and the particular expense of keeping a 90-year-old house operational that were reasonable questions and that she had framed as reasonable questions, while also, I understood from the specific texture of the conversations, having a position on the answer. Bernadette was 55, the youngest, a real estate agent in Lafayette, who had the specific professional knowledge of the Lafayette property market that made her both the most informed and the most motivated member of the family, when the question of what to do with the house on Pelican Street became a question the family needed to answer. The house was worth, at the time of my grandmother's death, and the subsequent claim, approximately $380,000. This was not a small number for a family in Lafayette, Louisiana. It was the specific number that explained why a claim that might otherwise have remained a family disagreement became a legal proceeding. The will left the house to me. I want to say this plainly before I describe why it was contested, because the plain statement of the will's content is necessary to understanding everything that follows. My grandmother's will, signed in 2018 and properly witnessed and notarized, left the house on Pelican Street to me, her granddaughter, specifically and with a specific explanation that I will describe. My aunts contested the will on 2 grounds. The first was testamentary capacity, the legal argument that my grandmother was not mentally competent when the will was signed, which was not a strong argument given that my grandmother had been specifically evaluated by her physician in 2018 and had been found to be in full possession of her faculties, the specific finding that the physician had documented, and that was part of the medical record. The second was undue influence, The legal argument that I had manipulated my grandmother into leaving me the house, which was the specific argument that required the specific evidence of my relationship with my grandmother across the 47 years she lived on Pelican Street to understand properly. Their attorney was a competent man named Francis Delacroix, who understood that the undue influence argument was the more viable of the two, and who built the case around the specific things that could be pointed to as evidence of influence. The fact that I had spent significant time at the house on Pelican Street, the fact that I had been involved in my grandmother's care in her final years, the fact that the will had been written after I had become her primary family contact. My attorney was a woman named Kathleen Fontenot, who had practiced estate and property law in Lafayette for 29 years, and who reviewed the situation with the specific assessment of someone who has seen the particular dynamic of family property disputes many times and who understood what she was working with. She said, "Simone, the undue influence argument is going to require us to demonstrate the nature of your relationship with your grandmother across many years, not only in the period immediately before the will was signed. We need to show that the bequest was consistent with a long-standing intent rather than the result of recent manipulation." I said, "I know what the relationship was. I need to know how to show it." She said, "Documentation, records of the relationship, witnesses. And if there is anything your grandmother left that expressed her intentions directly, that would be the most valuable evidence we could have." I said, "There is something." She said, "What?" I said, "There's something in the wall." I want to tell you about the specific relationship I had with my grandmother across the years before and after she put the tape in the wall, because the relationship is the foundation of everything, and it deserves to be described with the honesty it requires. I was the first grandchild, not the only grandchild. My aunts had a total of 7 children between them, 5 cousins who were born across the years after my birth. But the first, and the particular position of the first grandchild in a Louisiana Creole family of my grandmother's generation, is the position of someone who receives a specific quality of attention that later grandchildren receive in different measure, because the grandparents are still learning how to be grandparents when the first one arrives. My grandmother learned how to be a grandmother with me, which meant that I was the person she was closest to across my entire life, the grandchild who was present the most, who knew her the best, who understood her specific ways of understanding the world and her particular language of love, which was the language of action rather than of declaration. She cooked for me. Every Saturday morning when I was growing up, my parents dropped me at the house on Pelican Street, and my grandmother and I spent the morning in the kitchen, and she taught me to cook in the specific way of Louisiana Creole grandmothers, who understand that cooking is not the preparation of food, but the transmission of a specific accumulated knowledge about flavor and technique, and the particular relationship between a cuisine and the people who created it. I can make a roux in the specific way my grandmother made a roux, the specific dark roux of South Louisiana that requires the patience of someone who understands that rushing it burns it, and burning it means starting over. She spent 3 Saturday mornings teaching me roux alone, the specific focused pedagogy of someone who understood that the patience required to make a proper roux was itself the lesson. She also told me things. Not the family history in any formal sense, not the organized genealogy of dates and names that some families maintain, but the specific living history of the house on Pelican Street and the family who had inhabited it. She told me about her father Edouard building the house and what the neighborhood had looked like in 1928, and the particular quality of old-growth cypress that made the house sound after 90 years of Louisiana weather. She told me about her mother, Clotilde, and what Clotilde had been like, and what the specific texture of her childhood in that house had been. She told me about the years when the family had been poor in the specific way of Louisiana families during the Depression, the particular combination of having enough from the land and not having enough in the specific economic sense, and how the house had been the thing that made the difference between a family that survived the Depression and one that did not. She told me these things because she wanted me to know them, And because I was the person who listened in the specific way that made the telling worthwhile, with the genuine attention of someone for whom the stories were not family obligation, but actual sustenance. This is the specific quality of my relationship with my grandmother that my aunts characterized as influence. I want to be clear about what it was. It was a grandchild who listened and a grandmother who talked. It was two people who found in each other the specific quality of attention that made the relationship more valuable than the sum of its occasions. I was the one she called when the water heater needed replacing in 1997, and she needed someone to help manage the contractors. I was the one she called when the roof needed work in 2004, and she was worried about being overcharged. I was the one who drove her to medical appointments after she stopped driving in 2015, and who sat with her in the waiting rooms and who took notes on what the doctors said because she wanted to remember accurately. I was the one who came every Sunday for dinner from the time I was 21 and living on my own in Lafayette until the time she died. The Sunday dinner that she made every week without exception, and that was the specific recurring occasion of our relationship. None of this was exceptional. These are the things that grandchildren and grandmothers do when their relationship is genuine and when geography and circumstance make proximity possible. What made it the specific target of an undue influence argument was the specific thing that my relationship with my grandmother did and my aunt's relationships with her did not. It was the relationship she had been closest to for decades, and it was the relationship she had made her primary beneficiary. My aunts were not estranged from my grandmother. They visited. They called. Their children came to the house on Pelican Street for the family occasions. What they did not do, partly because of geography, partly because of the particular choices they had made about how to organize their adult lives, was maintain the specific daily and weekly contact that I maintained. This was their choice, not a criticism of them. People make choices about how to spend their time and proximity, and the particular investment of relationship maintenance is a real cost that not everyone is positioned to pay consistently. My aunts paid what they could. I paid more. The question of whether paying more entitled me to more was the specific question the estate proceeding was organized around. I found what was in the wall on a Saturday afternoon in November, 3 weeks after Kathleen Fontenot told me I needed evidence of my grandmother's long-standing intentions. I drove to the house on Pelican Street, which was occupied by my cousin Danielle, one of Bernadette's daughters, who had been living there since my grandmother's death with the specific understanding that someone should be in the house while the estate proceeding was pending. Danielle let me in. She was, among my cousins, the one who had always been most straightforwardly warm to me, and she understood what I was looking for, because I had told her about the wall on Pelican Street, and she showed me to the back room without comment. The storage room off the back hallway was the specific room it had always been, organized in my grandmother's system, the particular organized system of someone who kept things because things had use and who arranged them in the specific way that reflected a clear understanding of which things were used frequently and which were used rarely and which were kept because they might be needed someday. The wall panel behind the water heater was in the back left corner of the room, set slightly into the wall with the specific small handhold my great-grandfather Edward had built into it, so the panel could be removed and replaced without tools. I had known about this panel since I was 8 years old, when my grandmother had shown it to me during one of the Saturday mornings and explained what it was and why her father had built it, the particular pride she had in Edward's specific practical intelligence. I pressed the handhold. The panel released. Behind the panel was the specific space between the wall framing that Edward had designed to allow access to the pipes, approximately 18 inches wide and 12 inches deep, running the height of the wall. The water heater and its connections occupied the right portion of the space. The left portion was empty except for a rectangular object wrapped in plastic sheeting and secured with rubber bands that had deteriorated over the decades into something more suggestion than function. I lifted it out carefully. It was approximately the size and weight of a book. Through the plastic sheeting, I could feel the specific rectangular shape of something cassette-sized. I brought it to the kitchen table. Danielle stood beside me while I unwrapped it. Inside the plastic sheeting was a standard audio cassette tape, the kind that had been the primary domestic recording medium in 1987, in a clear plastic case with a small piece of masking tape across the top, on which my grandmother had written in her specific handwriting, the handwriting I had known since I first learned to read, for whoever needs this. MCA, 1987. I sat at my grandmother's kitchen table in her house on Pelican Street and held the cassette tape for a long time before I did anything else. I called Kathleen Fontenot that evening. She said, "You found something?" I said, "A cassette tape, dated 1987, in my grandmother's handwriting on the label." She said, "Do you know what's on it?" I said, "Not yet. I don't have a cassette player." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Simone, don't play it until I'm with you. I want to be present for the first listening, and I want to take notes while we listen." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because whatever is on that tape is going to be evidence, and I want the evidentiary chain of custody to be clean from the moment the content is known." I said, "How soon can you meet?" She said, "Monday morning, my office. Bring the tape and the plastic wrapping." I drove to her office on Monday morning with the tape in the specific protective bag Kathleen had described, sealed, with the date and time of retrieval written on a sticky note attached to the outside. Kathleen had a cassette player that she had apparently kept for exactly this kind of occasion, the specific occasion of evidence from an era when cassette tapes were the primary recording medium. She placed the tape in the player. She picked up her legal pad. She looked at me. She said, "Ready?" I said, "Yes." She pressed play. "I want to tell you what was on the tape, because the tape is the center of this story, and it deserves to be described with the full care that my grandmother put into making it." My grandmother's voice came out of the cassette player, and I want to describe the specific quality of it as it sounded in Kathleen Fontenot's office on a Monday morning in November, because I had not heard her voice since the day she died, and the hearing of it was the particular experience of someone encountering something they had not known they were missing until they heard it again. She sounded exactly as she had sounded in 1987, which was 22 years before she died. The specific voice of a 56-year-old woman from Lafayette, Louisiana. The particular musical quality of Louisiana French-inflected English that was her native register. She said, "My name is Marguerite Celestine Arsenault. I am making this recording on the 14th day of March 1987 at my family home on Pelican Street in Lafayette, Louisiana. I am making this recording because I have made a decision about this house, and I want there to be a record of my decision in my own voice so that my decision cannot be questioned by anyone who might have an interest in questioning it." She paused. She said, "This house belongs to my family. My father, Edouard Arsenault, built it in 1928 with his own hands from old-growth cypress that he selected himself from a mill in St. Mary Parish. He built it for his family and for his family's families and for as long as it stands. I grew up in this house and I came back to it in 1974 when my mother died, and I have been responsible for it since then." She paused again. She said, "I have 4 children, Raymond, Marie-Claire, Yvette, and Bernadette. I love all of them equally in the way that a mother loves her children, which is completely and specifically. But this house is not going to all of them equally. This house is going to the one who understands it." She said, "The one who understands it is Raymond's daughter, Simone." Kathleen Fontenot stopped writing on the legal pad and looked at me. I said, "Keep listening." She pressed the button again. My grandmother's voice. "Simone is 7 years old and she already knows more about this house than my own children do. She knows about the cypress and why her great-grandfather Edouard chose it. She knows about the wall panel in the back room and why her great-grandfather built it. She knows why the back porch faces east and not west, which was her great-grandfather's specific decision about the morning light. She knows these things because she asked me to tell her, and because she listened when I told her. She said, "A house is not a piece of property. A house is a specific living thing that requires someone who understands it to keep it alive." My mother understood this house, and she passed the understanding to me, and I am passing the understanding to Simone, because Simone is the one who is ready to receive it. She said, "I am not leaving this house to Simone in a document yet, because she is 7 years old, and documents made when grandchildren are 7 years old are documents that need to be reviewed when the grandchildren are grown. But I am making this recording so that when the time comes for the document, anyone who questions the document will know that I have been thinking about this for a long time, and that my decision is my decision and nobody else's." She said, "I have thought about this carefully, and I am telling the truth as clearly as I know how to tell it. My name is Marguerite Celestine Arsenault, and this house goes to Simone when I am gone." The tape ran for another few seconds, and then there was silence. Kathleen Fontenot put down her pen. She said, "Simone?" I said, "I know." She said, "She made this recording in 1987. You were 7 years old." I said, "Yes." She said, "She has been thinking about this for 34 years. I said, "Yes." She said, "And she put this in the wall so that nobody would find it unless they needed it." I said, "She told me where it was in 2019. 2 years before she died." Kathleen said, "Why do you think she waited until 2019? I said, "I think she was waiting until she knew it was going to be needed. She understood her daughters better than they understood themselves. She understood that the house was going to be contested." Kathleen said, "She was right." I said, "She was usually right." Kathleen put the cassette tape in an evidence bag. She wrote the date and time and both our names on the outside. She said, "This changes the case." I said, "I know." She said, "This is not the undue influence of a granddaughter who was close to her grandmother in her final years. This is a grandmother who made a decision when her granddaughter was 7 years old and held it for 34 years and put it in a wall for safekeeping." I said, "Yes." She said, "Your aunt's attorney is going to hear this, and he is going to advise them that the case is not what they thought it was." I said, "I know." She said, "What do you want to do?" I sat with the question for a moment. The question of what I wanted to do, not what I was entitled to do, not what I could do with the tape. I said, "I want my aunts to hear the tape, not as evidence in a proceeding. I want them to hear their mother's voice telling them what she decided and why. Before any of this goes further." Kathleen said, "Are you sure?" I said, "My grandmother said she loved all of them equally. She did. I want them to hear that from her before they hear anything else." Kathleen said, "That's a generous choice." I said, "It's what she would have done." The family meeting happened on a Friday evening at the house on Pelican Street. Kathleen was present. Frances Delacroix, my aunt's attorney, was present. My father was present. Marie-Claire, Yvette, and Bernadette were present. Danielle, who still lived in the house, made coffee and sat in the kitchen and did not attend the formal meeting, which was her specific and entirely appropriate choice. I had thought about how to begin. I had considered several approaches and had settled on the specific direct one, which was to place the cassette player on the table, place the tape in it, and press play without preamble. I said, "I want to play something for you before anyone says anything else." I pressed play. My grandmother's voice filled the room on Pelican Street. I watched my aunts while the tape played. I want to describe what I saw accurately, because I think accuracy serves this part of the story more than any other. Marie-Claire closed her eyes about 30 seconds into the tape and did not open them until it ended. She was not crying. She was doing the specific thing of someone receiving something with their full interior attention, the particular quality of listening that happens when the sound is someone you loved and who is gone, and whose voice you did not expect to hear again. Yvette put her hand over her mouth partway through and kept it there. When the tape ended, she removed her hand, and she looked at the cassette player and she said, very quietly, "She sounds exactly like herself." Bernadette did not look at the cassette player. She looked at me, across the table, for the full duration of the tape. When it ended, she was still looking at me, and her expression was the specific expression of someone who has understood something they should have understood a long time ago. The room was very quiet after the tape ended. Frances Delacroix said, "I need a few minutes with my clients." Kathleen said, "Of course." We moved to the kitchen. Danielle poured coffee without being asked, the specific intuition of someone who understood that the moment required something ordinary to happen. 22 minutes later, Francis Delacroix came to the kitchen door. He said, "Ms. Fontenot, my clients would like to speak with Ms. Arsenault." I want to describe the conversation that followed, because it is the most important part of this story. My aunts were seated at the dining room table when I came back in. The cassette player was still in the center of the table. The tape was still in it. Marie Claire said, "Simone, we need to say something to you." I said, "All right." She said, "We heard our mother, in her own voice, 34 years ago, saying what she wanted." She said, "We had told ourselves that the will was something that happened in her final years because of your influence. We had told ourselves that our mother, in her right mind, would have divided the house equally among her children, or at least among her grandchildren." She said, "We were wrong." She was thinking about this in 1987. We were not even thinking about it in 1987. She was thinking about it, and she knew, and she put what she knew in the wall. Yvette said, "She put it in the wall because she knew we would question it." I said, "She put it there for whoever needed it. That's what she wrote on the label." Bernadette said, "She put it there for you." I said, "She put it there because she knew someday someone would need to hear her say it in her own voice. She trusted the house to keep it until then." There was a long silence. Marie Claire said, "She said she loved us all equally." I said, "She did. She talked about all of you. Not in this recording, but across my entire life. She talked about what she loved about each of you specifically. She talked about Marie Claire's precision and Yvette's directness and Bernadette's energy. She talked about my father's patience. She loved all of you, and she talked about you with the specific warmth of someone who understood her children as the specific people they were. Marie Claire said, "She didn't leave us the house." I said, "No." Marie Claire said, "Because you understood it." I said, "That's what she said." Yvette said, "Did you know? When she was alive?" I said, "I knew she intended to leave it to me. She didn't tell me about the recording until 2019, and she didn't tell me it was a recording, only that there was something in the wall." Bernadette said, "Did you know why?" I said, "I knew because of every Saturday morning in that kitchen, and every Sunday dinner, and every conversation across my entire life. I knew because she told me things about this house that she didn't tell anyone else. I knew because I listened." Bernadette said, "We didn't listen enough." I said nothing. She said, "I'm a real estate agent. I know what this house is worth." I looked at it and saw the number. Mama looked at it and saw what it was. I said, "Yes." Marie Claire said, "We're withdrawing the claim." She said it in the specific way of someone who has made a decision and who is stating it as what it is, a decision, rather than as a proposal or a negotiation. She said, Not because of the legal situation, though I understand from Frances that the tape changes the legal situation significantly. Because our mother's voice was in that wall for 34 years telling us exactly what she wanted, and we are not going to contest it. She said, and because whatever we thought about how this happened, whatever we told ourselves about influence and manipulation, she settled it in 1987 when you were 7 years old, and she put it in the wall of the house her father built because she knew it would keep it safe. I looked at my 3 aunts. I said, she loved all of you. I want to say that again specifically. She talked about you, all of you, every Sunday dinner. Yvette said, she talked about us. I said, she talked about Marie Claire's discipline when she was a pharmacist. She talked about Yvette's patience with her patients. She talked about Bernadette's eye for the specific things that make a house a home, which was not incidental given her profession. She talked about my father's teaching and how proud she was. She talked about all of you. Marie Claire said, she talked about you too, I imagine. I said, she talked about me as the one who was going to be responsible for the house. That was how she talked about me. Yvette said, that's who you are. I said, that's who she made me. I want to tell you what happened in the months after the family meeting, because the story does not end at the table, and the honesty the story requires includes what came after. The claim was formally withdrawn in December. The estate proceedings concluded. The house on Pelican Street was transferred to me in January. Danielle continued living in the house for 6 months after the transfer, at my invitation, because she had been living there through the proceedings and uprooting her life in the middle of a difficult period was not something I was going to require of her. She found an apartment in Lafayette in the spring and moved in April with the specific gratitude of someone who has been treated better than the circumstances required. I moved into the house in May. I want to describe what it was like to move into the house on Pelican Street specifically, because the description matters to this story. The house smelled like her. This is not a remarkable observation in the abstract, but in the specific moment of walking through the door with my boxes on a Saturday morning in May, the smell of the house was the smell of every Saturday morning of my childhood, the specific combination of old cypress wood and the particular cleaning products she had always used, and something else that I have never been able to name, but that I understood the moment I walked in as the specific olfactory signature of a place where someone has lived for a long time with specific habits and specific rituals and specific presence. I stood in the hallway for a long time. Then I went to the kitchen and I made a roux. The dark roux, the patient, slow-stirring roux that takes 45 minutes and requires the specific attention of someone who understands that leaving it is not an option. I made it in her cast-iron pot, which was in the cabinet where it had always been, and I stirred it for 45 minutes in the kitchen of the house on Pelican Street, while the May light came through the kitchen window and the pecan tree in the backyard was visible, and the fig tree her father planted in 1932 had its early summer leaves. When the roux was ready, I put it in the refrigerator to be used later. I did not make anything with it that day. I just made it. I thought about her the whole time I was stirring. I called each of my aunts in the weeks after moving in, not with any specific agenda, to report on what I was finding and what the house was showing me and what needed attention. Bernadette knew a roofer she trusted and gave me his name. Yvette knew a plumber who had worked on old houses in Lafayette and who understood what old plumbing required. Marie Claire helped me locate a cypress specialist who could evaluate the exterior siding and tell me what it needed. This was not a dramatic reconciliation. It was the specific practical collaboration of family members who share an interest in a property and who have, after the particular difficulty of a contested proceeding, arrived at a place where the interest in the property can be the thing they share without requiring the preceding difficulty to be resolved or forgotten or pretended away. My grandmother had 4 children and she knew them all. She knew that they would be who they were after she was gone, that Marie Claire would want efficiency, that Yvette would want directness, that Bernadette would want the house to be managed well as a piece of property. She knew that they would not simply accept a will that seemed to come out of nowhere in the final years of her life. That is why she made the recording in 1987. Not because she was afraid of them, because she understood them and she wanted them to hear her voice saying what she knew to be true in a moment when no one could question her clarity or her independence. She made the recording and she put it in the wall of the house her father built because the house was the most honest place she knew and because the wall had kept her father's pipes safe for 60 years and could keep her truth safe for 34 more. She was right about all of it. I want to tell you what the house on Pelican Street is now, because what it is now is what this story was always building toward. I live in it. I am the person responsible for it. I have been in it for 3 years now, and I have learned things about the house that I did not know even after a lifetime of Saturday mornings and Sunday dinners in it. The specific things you learn about a house when you are inside it every day, rather than present in it on specific occasions. The cypress wood, 95 years old now, is as sound as it was when Edward selected it from the mill in St. Mary Parish in 1928. I have had it evaluated twice, and both times the evaluator said the same thing, which is that old-growth cypress in a house that has been maintained properly can last indefinitely, that the specific quality of the material and the specific quality of the maintenance are together. The reason the house is still standing in its original structure after nearly a century of Lafayette weather. The pecan tree my grandmother planted in the backyard in 1978 produces pecans every fall. The fig tree her father planted in 1932 produces figs every summer, and the figs are sweet in the specific way of figs, from a tree that has been growing in the same soil for 91 years. The wall panel in the back room behind the water heater is still there. I have not changed it. I checked it when I moved in, and it releases and replaces exactly as it did when I found the tape. The specific elegant handhold that Edward built into it 95 years ago working exactly as intended. The panel is empty now, or rather, it contains what I put in it 6 months after I moved in, which is a note I wrote to whoever comes after me. Not a legal document. Not a recording. A note, the same kind of note my grandmother left in 1987 before recordings were common, and when paper and a cassette tape were the available tools, explaining what I want to say about the house and who I think should have it and why, folded into a plastic bag sealed against the Lafayette humidity, placed behind the panel in the specific space Edward built for keeping important things. I do not know when it will be needed. My grandmother did not know in 1987 either. She trusted the wall. So do I. Here is what a cassette tape in a wall built from cypress wood in 1928, and a Saturday morning in a kitchen making roux and a grandmother who trusted the house to keep her truth taught me. I know that the most important things are sometimes said in the most private ways, not as declarations or public statements, but as the specific, careful quiet of someone who understands that the right moment for the thing they have to say is not the present moment, but some future moment they cannot foresee, and who builds the trust in the place that will hold the saying until the moment arrives. My grandmother knew in 1987 that what she wanted to say needed to wait. She could have told her daughters. She could have put the decision in a will in 1987 and let them know about it. She did neither because she understood that saying it then, in the context of then, would produce a different response than saying it would produce in the context of when it was needed, when there was no her to defend or explain or clarify, only her voice from a cassette tape in a wall, and the specific clarity of what she had said 34 years before anyone needed to hear it. I know that the specific relationship between a person and a place is a form of knowledge that cannot be transferred through observation alone, but requires the particular sustained presence that makes a place legible in the specific way it becomes legible to someone who is truly inside it. I understood the house on Pelican Street because I had been inside it across my entire life, with the full attention of someone who listened when my grandmother told me what she was teaching me. And that understanding was the specific thing she recognized and trusted with the house. I know that the wall in the back room of the house on Pelican Street has held the truth through 34 years of Lafayette hurricanes and summers and the particular weight of a family's disagreements about what belongs to whom, and that the cypress wood Edward selected from a mill in St. Mary Parish in 1928 is the same cypress wood that held the panel in place through all of it, and that the specific quality of material and the specific quality of intention are together why things last. And I know that my grandmother, who was born in that house, and who died in it, and who lived most of her life in it, and who understood it in the specific, complete way of someone who has been responsible for a thing across 47 years, was the most patient woman I have ever known. The specific patience of someone who was willing to wait 34 years for the right moment because she understood that the right moment was worth the waiting. She was right. The house is still standing. I made roux this morning. 45 minutes of slow stirring in the cast iron pot in the kitchen of the house on Pelican Street, in the May light through the kitchen window, with the pecan tree visible in the backyard and the figs coming in on her father's tree. She taught me how. That is my story. A cassette tape in a wall from 1987. A grandmother who knew that the wall would keep it safe. A Monday morning in November when I pressed play and heard her voice exactly as it had always sounded. And a house built from old-growth cypress in 1928 that is still standing because the right person understood it well enough to take care of it. If this reminded you of something someone you loved put away carefully for you to find when you needed it, the specific gift of a truth held in trust until the trust was required, I want to hear from you. Drop it in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to know that the things built well and kept carefully can hold what matters until the holding is no longer needed. Hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.